Our guest today is Dinesh D'Souza, best-selling author, award-winning filmmaker, and former Reagan White House advisor. His latest documentary, The Dragon's Prophecy, examines the roots of today's Middle East conflict. Dinesh, thanks for being here.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's speak a little bit about Iran. What is happening right now? What changed inside the country that turned fear into open revolt? Why do we see 12 innocent people slaughtered? If you can give us your thoughts, would appreciate it.
Well, Iran represents the capture by radical Islam of its first and really only major state. We had, of course, the Taliban in Afghanistan, but that's more of a ragtag operation. With the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the radical Muslims, they'd been around much earlier than that, going back perhaps to the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s. But they were a kind of outside operation. They functioned inside of societies where they were treated as rebel force, or they were these kind of terrorist operations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, that type of and they always needed somebody else to sponsor them and give them access to the monkey bars, as happened, for example, in preparation of 9/11. But the Iranian Revolution was a very important event because the mullahs got a hold of a whole country. And in fact, they established a new type of regime, which is theocratic government in the direct sense of the term. Often when people speak about theocracy, they're not really talking about theocracy. They're talking about some sort of a king who is maybe encircled by holy men, but is not himself a clergyman. And theocracy, both in Europe, even in the Muslim world, was typically some sort of a caliph or caliph, and this guy might be advised by the mullahs, but he wasn't himself a mullah. But with Iran, we saw this unique rule of the mullahs, and it's proven to be quite durable. I mean, it's lasted now for, 45 years. And so it is, to me, exhilarating and thrilling, surprising in a good way to see that, even over this half-century period, the propaganda hasn't made its way all the way through. And the Iranian people have kind of maintained enough of their independence to encourage to rebel even under very difficult circumstances. Now, I think that there are a couple of events that prepared the ground for this. The joint operation between Trump and Israel to pulverize Iran was clearly significant and crucial, in fact. I also think that the capture of Maduro in Venezuela has emboldened the Iranians because they would like to see something similar happen in their country, which would make it be an even bigger event than in Venezuela. And so for all these reasons, this is something I'm watching with great interest, but also I would say unconcealed excitement.
Iran has seen protests before. How is this moment different from all the others in your eyes?
It's different, I think, in one critical way, and that's quite honestly Trump. Trump has shown, contrary, by the way, to many people who thought he was going to be some sort of an isolationist, Trump does not want to commit the United States to these kind of endless wars, as he puts it, involving commitments of troops, involving trying to somehow manage the interior affairs of other countries. All of this became sort of tragically exposed in the Afghanistan and Iraq operations. I mean, you had U.S. soldiers presiding over like a bunch of tribesmen sitting in a circle and figuring out ways of resolving disputes with each other. So the United States doesn't want to do that. But Trump has made it clear he's not against vigorous and sometimes unpredictable military action to pulverize bad guys, pulverize bad regimes. And in a sense, I mean, just his post most recently, he's telling the Iranian people, kind of amp it up, guys, like do more, challenge these people, and don't worry, he goes, quote, help is on its way. Which, think of how emboldening that is. Now, contrast this, for example, where under Obama, when you had the 2009 protests, it was very clear that Obama wanted to stay out for whatever reason. The benign explanation is he was convinced that it would somehow be interpreted the wrong way. It might even strengthen the regime in some ways. I don't think that that's the correct reading. I think Obama is actually on the side of Iran, and he supports the mullahs, and he was for the regime and against the demonstrators. But however one interprets Obama's action, or perhaps inaction is a better word, the key difference here is the difference between who's in the saddle. Is it Obama or is it Trump?
Now, for people who don't know the history, what was Iran like before 1979? And what fundamentally changed after the Islamic Revolution?
Well, there was, in the middle of the 20th century, a powerful kind of secularizing trend in the Muslim world. And we saw it in Turkey with Ataturk. Ataturk was kind of Turkey's Gandhi. And this guy went really far. I mean, he like outlawed the veil. He took mosques and basically took them apart and converted them into museums. And he had the prestige and reputation of being the kind of savior of the country, as I mentioned, kind of Turkey's Gandhi. And so he got away with it. Now, he didn't get away with it permanently because over time, a kind of Islamist backlash developed. And Turkey today, I would say, is leaning in the sort of Islamist direction. But the Ataturk formula held for many decades. And I would argue that some of its influence is still evident today. Now, the Shah of Iran was kind of doing the same thing. And while the elder Shah, Reza Shah, was a pretty powerful guy, his son, Reza Shah Pahlavi, was a little bit of a spoiled, Western-educated, somewhat wimpy character, decent, but even though he was accused by the Carter administration, oh, he's ruthless, he's got a secret police, his real problem was the opposite. He was actually weak. And when the mullahs began to challenge him, he basically said, well, I can't get rid of those people. They're Iranians the same as me. And so he, in a sense, allowed them to gather more and more power. He could have crushed the movement in its infancy, but he chose not to. And ultimately, the movement became really powerful. It was indirectly supported by France and the United States. Again, the United States under a democratic administration. Carter's objective appeared to be, let's pull the Persian rug out from under the Shah. He's a bit of an autocrat. He's a dictator. Jimmy Carter, campaigned on human rights. I don't think Carter anticipated, this is what makes Carter different from Obama. Carter did not anticipate that in getting rid of the lesser evil, he would get, in fact, the greater evil. And so he became, in a sense, the enabler of radical Islam getting a hold of its first major state. A complete transformation of a whole society, not easy to achieve. And yet the mullahs set to do it with a kind of determination that from a distance, because I hate those people, but nevertheless, you have to admire the tenacity with which they've carried this out over many decades.
Now, many Iranians today openly support Israel. Why has Israel become such an obsession for this Iranian regime, so much that they spend billions and billions of dollars just to try to destroy the state of Israel?
There looks to me that there are only two groups of people in the world that know how to fight a radical Islam. The Israelis are at the top of the list. And I attribute this not just to sort of the native genius of the Jews, but I attribute it really to the fact that Israel has grown up in a really bad neighborhood, right? When you live in a really bad neighborhood, you become very good at survival skills, looking over your shoulder, anticipating trouble before it starts, dealing with it swiftly and effectively. So the Israelis have demonstrated that. Now, it should be said that there are some of the Muslim regimes that are also fighting radical Islam, and in some cases pretty effectively. I saw recently a conversation with one of the top people at UAE, United Arab Emirates, and he was like, anti-Semitism in Europe and America is an opinion. He says anti-Semitism in the UAE is illegal. And he said, you won't find any Muslim Brotherhood here. You won't find any large groups of people praying in the middle of the street. He goes, that's not permitted. We don't stand for any of that. He goes, only you people in the West do that. So it's really interesting that it seems to me that the admiration for Israel is a recognition on the part of freedom-loving Iranians that the Israelis are not only with them in principle, but the Israelis are actually fighting radical Islam at many different levels and at considerable risk to themselves. They're taking far more risk, for example, than the Americans do. And so, the Iranians should also know that in the conservative movements of the West, they have allies, but their allies are not quite as involved, directly effective in the way that the Israelis are. I think for this reason, Israel is kind of numero uno in the kind of totem pole of admiration.
If the Iranian regime collapsed, how much of the Middle East conflict would immediately change? How exactly do you envision the Middle East without Iran?
It would be huge because Iran is important in a number of ways. There are only a handful of really powerful Muslim states in the Middle East, right? There is Egypt, there's Saudi Arabia, and there's Iran. I would say those are the top three. And they all bring something different to the table. Saudi Arabia has a lot of wealth. They've got Mecca and Medina, the two holy sites. Egypt is a large, middle-class, educated society. The Iranians basically bring nuclear weapons, and they are a large country, and they do have oil. And so they're a powerful country. These three have been jostling over the centuries for preeminence in the region. And in some ways, you could say that Egypt and Saudi are now mobilized together against Iran. And so the collapse of Iran would really change the weight, the equation, the power structure of the Middle East. I think it would also deliver radical Islam a huge blow at a time when radical Islam is making a lot of inroads into the West. We see Islamic influence in Australia, in Canada, all over Europe, taking over towns. I mean, London is done. I live in the red state, conservative state of Texas, but even here, a kind of mushrooming of mosques, Islamists running for the school board. So there's clearly a kind of global campaign underway. But in terms of holding on to a major state, Iran is the gorilla of radical Islam. So bringing down the gorilla, I think, would be a tremendous blow to the morale of radical Islam and a boost, consequently, to sort of anti-Islamist and freedom-loving forces around the world.
In your opinion, why are we suddenly seeing prominent conservatives blaming Israel or Jews instead of radical Islam?
This, to me, is a real conundrum because I have not seen or heard anything like this. I came of age in the Reagan administration. In my 20s, I worked in the Reagan White House. So I've been around the conservative movement for 40 years. And this upsurge of blatant anti-Jewish, anti-Israel sentiment led by people, oddly enough, who never used to be that way. So this is a kind of a volte-face, a turning around, a surprising kind of twist. And the motives of it remain, to me, a little bit unclear. I've seen a lot of different, it must be this, it must be that. Are these people getting paid? What could possibly explain this bizarre kind of U-turn on the part of people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens? But there are also some supplementary characters here in that kind of platoon. So for someone like me, even though Israel has not traditionally been my issue, I've focused on history and politics. Most of my books and films have been about America. I've, in a sense, been drawn out into this and forced to become a lot more outspoken and to attack by name people that I've known for a long time, simply because I'm not only bewildered, but really outraged at the way in which these people are undermining the Trump and MAGA coalition, undermining, in my view, the interests of the United States. So it isn't just like kind of disloyalty to Israel or the articulation of a certain type of distasteful naked bigotry that we're seeing, by the way, not just in regard to Jews, but in some cases with regard to blacks, this kind of white identitarian politics that hovers around these movements. So there is a kind of poison here, and some of us are quite determined to root it out.
When people on the right say that Israel controls American politics, are we seeing recycled anti-Semitism or something new?
I think that, there is Jews are a very successful group in the world. They are part of what Thomas Sowell, many, many years ago, talked about as these kinds of one of the successful tribes of the world. They're not the only successful tribe. There are a number of others. The overseas Chinese are a very successful tribe. The Mormons are a successful tribe as a group. Of course, the WASP Episcopalians are a successful tribe. Asian Indians are successful tribes in many parts of the world. And so it's not surprising that successful groups have influence in the sectors that they go into, very disproportionate to their numbers. So this has been noticed. But for many years in American life, you couldn't really say it. There was a kind of taboo around it. And I think what's happened in our society, this is partly in reaction to a lot of the COVID authoritarianism, the digital censorship, the DEI, you can't say this, you can't say that. It's almost like there's been a kind of explosion in the opposite direction in which people are blurting out all the things that they were never supposed to say. Now, in doing so, they have a false confidence that because they're saying something kind of outrageous or previously taboo, it must be true. And that is where the fallacy kind of comes in. Yes, I would argue that Jews as a group in American society probably have disproportionate influence. So, by the way, do a half dozen or more other groups, but it doesn't follow, and it is not emphatically the case, that a small country like Israel, the size of New Jersey, with a GDP and a GNP much smaller than America, and with no amount of weaponry that can match America, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to claim that the Israeli small terrier dog is somehow controlling the American elephant. It defies reason, it defies logic. And if anything, I think in Israel, the concern is the other way around. Does America, because of the aid it gives to Israel, not to mention the political support, is America in a position to bully Israel? Don't go into Iran. Don't finish the job. Let the mullahs hang on to power. I mean, the evidence, I think, seems to be pretty clear that between, say, Netanyahu and Trump, it's Trump who's calling the shots and not so much Netanyahu, in my opinion.
When we hear the America First argument, what are conservatives and people not understanding about the partnership with Israel? And if they do abandon Israel, what do they lose morally and strategically? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, the attack on Israel and the Jews, very interestingly, has a kind of a theological component and a political component. The theological component seems puzzling at first glance. Why would people like Tucker or Candace, who have never shown any great interest in theology, be suddenly invoking replacement theology, the quotations from the church fathers? I mean, I smell a rat. And quite clearly, this is intended as a sort of confusion mechanism, or maybe even a battering ram against evangelical Christians who often invoke biblical reasons for supporting Israel. And I think this is really why the anti-Israel right has kind of churned up the theological argument. Not that they're serious about it, not that they even believe it, but it is a way of them of sowing theological confusion and trying to put a wedge between the evangelical Christian base, which is very pro-Israel in general, and Israel. The political component, interestingly, is usually couched in terms of the influence of AIPAC, the influence of Israel. I've never seen anyone seriously contend that it is in an age where we're seeing not only the ascent of radical Islam, but also the so-called red-green alliance, which is to say a rather blatant pairing up of the cultural left around the world and radical Islam. It seems to make complete sense for the people on the other side, namely the Jews and the Christians, or namely Israel and the United States, to draw closer together. There's a kind of inexorable and even Machiavellian logic to that. And I've never seen anyone successfully defeat that or show why it is not in America's interest to ally with Israel. There are some vague suggestions that somehow Israel is drawing America into battles that it otherwise would not be part of. But this is based on the lunatic presupposition that somehow if America stayed out of it, the radical Muslims would leave us alone.
Why do you think that Israel is losing moral support in the West despite fighting a genocidal enemy in Hamas? Why do you think that they've lost this media war?
I think the answer is that the power of the Red-Green Alliance worldwide is very great. Let's think about it this way. The Muslims, first of all, bring massive numbers, right? There are over 2 billion of them versus 20 million Jews. So we're not talking about the Jews being outnumbered 10 to 1. We're talking about massive outnumbering. Second, the radical Muslims control a lot of wealth. So they're able to buy a lot of influence in the West. In some ways, it's kind of crazy on social media. People say, well, are you getting $7,000 from Israel? Well, the radical Muslims are buying political science departments. They're not buying some obscure influencer on TikTok or X. They're taking over whole media outlets and university departments. And so the power of that can't be underestimated. Let's remember the cultural left has huge control of the megaphones of society. I'm thinking here of the combined power of academia and the media and the entertainment industry. And so when you have this pact between the cultural left and the radical Muslims, we know what the radical Muslims supply, right? They supply money, they supply numbers worldwide, and they also supply jihadis. I mean, they supply suicide bombers. They supply troops that you're not going to get. Some LGBTQ activist isn't going to do what a Hamas operative, for example, would do. But what does the cultural left provide? Well, they provide access to the corridors of power. They provide entree into the massive theft schemes that they have established inside of Western society. We're seeing this with the Somali fraud, for example. And they also provide access to media. So this isn't all like Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera by itself would be powerless. But Al Jazeera, buttressed by the BBC and NPR and NBC and CNN, the combined force there is very large. And the conservative outlets are small compared to the large megaphones on the cultural left.
What role do you think Qatar plays in the anti Israel, anti Semitic rhetoric that's going on? On the one hand, we see that they are partners with the US and they were also the hostage negotiators with Israel, but they're also shielding the Hamas, heads. They're kind of playing a role for everyone and funding the Western institutions and the journalists and things like that. It seems like Qatar should be spoken about more than it really is.
Well, I agree. And I think that, think of it this way, we have these kind of named terrorist organizations like ISIS, Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, Boko Haram. So Iran is in some way the patron of the of militant Islam of that stripe. I'm not saying Iran supports all of those movements, but it supports most of them. And it symbolizes that type of approach to jihad. Now, there's a second approach, and this is the Muslim Brotherhood approach, which is to work kind of within the orbit of the world as it is, to go to conferences, to engage in diplomacy, to peacefully infiltrate. This is the role that Qatar has selected for itself. And it's sort of well positioned to play it because, see, if Western society were united, then it would be very easy to take Qatar and put it in the same camp as Iran and basically argue that this is sort of the, quote, good cop, bad cop routine of radical Islam. One guy pretends to be the nice guy, the other guy pretends to be the bad guy. They're actually working completely in cahoots. Now, this is the case. The problem is that when Western society is itself divided, a guy like Trump is now in a situation where he wants to get the hostages out. He needs to figure out some way to communicate with Hamas. The Qataris are right at his doorstep. First of all, they know how to flatter Trump. Oh, the great Mr. Trump, we have a gift of a plane for you. It's waiting right outside. Come take a look, sir. And then, hey, guess what? We actually know these Hamas guys. Not that we're on their side and all, but we're kind of in their neighborhood. So why don't you give us your message? We will take it to them. We will bring you there. It's a little bit like the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He used to play this mediating role in America where he would go to these corporations. In fact, often he would stir up a bunch of racial activists to call these corporations racist. Then he'd show up at the corporate CEO's doorstep. He'd say, listen, the brothers are very angry, but you know what? I can really help you here. All you have to do is funnel some money my way and let me use your plane from time to time. So this is a familiar routine within Western society. I just think the Qataris have been very cunning and quite effective in their own way in being able to operate in a manner that makes them more difficult to oppose than someone who's quite obviously a bad cop like the mullahs in Iran.
Now, speaking about the Muslim Brotherhood, what do you think about the Muslim Brotherhood's future in America with the recent appointment of Mamdani in New York?
I'm giving some thought to doing a film on this topic because I think it's a really important topic, namely the infiltration of Western societies. As I mentioned earlier, it's pretty far advanced in some European countries. I know it's present in Australia or Canada. I'm not sure how pervasive. But the fact that we see it not just in Minneapolis, not just in Dearborn, Michigan, not just even in Mamdani's New York, and we're likely to see more of it, but even in a conservative state like Texas, tells me two things. One, it's happening all over the place. B, or second, while the left is fostering it, enabling it, encouraging it, the right is somewhat immobilized in not quite knowing what to do about it. And the reason that the right is immobilized is that, by and large, modern American conservatism is a defense of the Constitution and particularly a defense of the various liberties that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights. Freedom of association, property rights, the right to assemble, the right to free speech. Now, here's the key point that the radical Muslims travel on the passport of Western freedom. They, let's say, for example, in Texas, I'm just giving a hypothetical example, but not far off from what's actually going on. Let's say the radical Muslims decide, we want to buy 1,000 acres of land in Texas and create a massive madrasa, an all-boys academy which will get instruction in the Quran and in Sharia. Now, if you say no, they'll say, wait a minute. We thought that you support private property. We're buying this with our own money. We thought you support private institutions. We thought you support private education. Certainly you support freedom of assembly. You're not going to tell us now that you are against freedom of speech, are you? So what I'm getting at is that, and this is the kind of Qatar Muslim Brotherhood strategy, which is to travel on the roads that are permitted to you. But this is the scary part, toward a destination that ultimately undermines all those liberties. So it's almost as if Western society, through its own principles, is enabling the gathering storm that will, in the end, put an end to those liberties themselves, put an end to the Constitution, has as its endpoint a completely different type of society. So figuring out not only how bad this is, the nature of the threat, but also how to think about it and what to do about it, those are some of the tasks I'm setting for myself for 2026.
I'm looking forward to seeing that future documentary. I want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate all of your insights. And wish you a lot of success in your future projects and endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you very much.